The alarm tore through the barracks before I had even opened my second eye. Red light pulsed across the metal walls of Outpost Farron, and the floor trembled under my feet as something large moved in the sky above us. I had felt fear before. Every soldier has. But the sound that came next was not an alarm at all. It was a voice, human, calm, cutting through the chaos like a blade through fog. "Get up, now, they are early." That voice belonged to Sergeant Owen Pierce, and in the 3 months I had served beside his unit, I had never once heard him raise it. He did not raise it now either. That was what unsettled me most. My name, in the closest sound your language can form, is Rain. I am Saith, a species built for calculation, patience, and order. We do not startle easily. Our bodies read danger the way your instruments read temperature, a steady climb, never a shock. So when my hearts began to hammer inside my chest that morning, I did not understand what was happening to me. I only knew that something in the air had changed, and my body recognized it before my mind could explain it. I had been assigned to this joint outpost as part of a coalition exchange. One soldier from each allied species placed among a human unit to study their tactics and, if I am honest, to watch over them. My superiors did not trust humans. They said humans were unpredictable, emotional, prone to acting before thinking. I had read the reports. I had seen the numbers. Humans lost soldiers in numbers no safe commander would accept, and yet somehow they kept winning battles that should have ended them. I did not understand it. Not then. I pulled on my gear, the plated suit fitting close to my narrow frame, and stepped out into the corridor. Human soldiers moved past me in both directions, boots slamming against metal, voices low and fast. Nobody screamed, nobody froze. It was almost like watching a machine, except machines do not laugh, and somewhere down that corridor, someone was laughing. I found the source near the armory. A young soldier named Daniel Marsh was checking his weapon and grinning as he did it, joking with the woman beside him, Corporal Grace Bennett, who rolled her eyes but smiled anyway. "Guess breakfast is canceled," Daniel said. "Guess so," Grace answered. "Try not to die hungry." I stood there, uncertain whether to speak. On my homeworld, humor before battle was considered a sign of poor discipline, a mind unable to grasp the seriousness of its situation. And yet these two soldiers moved with more precision than most Saith recruits I had trained beside. Their hands did not shake. Their eyes were sharp. The joke, I realized slowly, was not weakness. It was something else. I did not have a word for it yet. Sergeant Pierce found me a moment later, his expression steady, his tone even. "Wren," he said, "Command wants you on the eastern ridge with 2nd Squad. You all right with that?" "I am prepared," I answered, because it was the correct answer, the expected answer. He studied me for a moment longer than necessary, the way humans sometimes do when they suspect you are hiding something. "You don't look prepared," he said. "You look like you're doing math in your head." "I am always doing math in my head," I told him, and for the first time, he laughed, a short, genuine sound. "Good," he said. "Keep doing that. Just don't let the math scare you more than the enemy does." I did not understand the warning then. I understand it now, and it haunts me more than anything the enemy ever did. We moved out within the hour, boots and treads crunching over the frozen ground of the ridge that overlooked the valley below. Outpost Farron sat at the heart of a resource corridor that both our coalition and the Skarn Concord wanted desperately. The Skarn were not like us. They were not like humans either. They did not think in terms of individual survival. Their soldiers moved as one enormous will, thousands of bodies acting on a single impulse, sacrificing themselves without hesitation because the collective mind behind them did not value any single life at all. We had fought the Skarn before, my people and I, on other worlds, in other wars. We had learned to respect their numbers and fear their patience. What we had never learned, what no coalition species had learned, was how to break their will entirely. You could destroy 1,000 Skarn soldiers, and the mind behind them would send 1,000 more without pause, without grief, without doubt. I stood on that ridge with 3 humans and 2 other coalition soldiers, watching the horizon, and I felt the old fear settle over me, the fear of facing an enemy that did not know how to stop. "Movement," said Lieutenant Claire Whitfield, crouched beside a scanner unit, her voice flat and controlled. Multiple contacts, low altitude, coming in fast. How many? I asked. She looked up at me, and for a moment, her eyes carried something I could not name. All of them, she said. I think they're sending all of them. Below us, the tree line began to shudder, and dark shapes poured out from beneath the canopy, like ink spilling across the snow. I had seen Scarn assaults before, but never like this. Never so many, never so fast. My mind, trained for calculation, began running numbers automatically, comparing our strength to theirs, searching for a ratio that would make sense of survival. The numbers did not make sense. Not even close. Beside me, Corporal Grace Bennett checked her weapon one final time, her breathing steady despite what she was looking at. I expected fear. I expected the kind of hesitation my own people would show when faced with impossible odds. Instead, she turned to me and smiled, a small, tired smile, and said something I would remember for the rest of my life. "Well," she said, "guess it's a good day to find out what we're made of." I did not know it then, but she was not speaking only for herself. She was speaking for every human on that ridge, every human I would come to fight beside in the hours that followed, every human whose strange, fearless calm would teach me the true meaning of terror, not the terror of facing an enemy, but the terror of standing beside something the enemy could never understand and never defeat. The horizon darkened further, the Scarn swarm rolling forward like a living storm, and Sergeant Pierce's voice came calm and clear over the comm channel. "Hold the line," he said. "Just hold the line." I looked at the humans around me, steady, quiet, unafraid in a way that defied everything I had been taught about their kind, and for the first time since arriving at Outpost Farron, I understood that I had misjudged them completely. I did not yet know how completely. Before the swarm reached us, there was a strange stretch of time where nothing happened at all. The dark shapes below kept climbing, slow and steady, and the six of us on the ridge simply waited. I had never experienced a silence like that one. It was not empty, it was full, packed tight with everything each of us was thinking and refusing to say out loud. I used that silence to study my companions, the way I had been trained to study allies and enemies alike, searching for patterns, searching for weakness. Lieutenant Whitfield kept her eyes fixed on the scanner, fingers moving in small, precise motions, adjusting settings that did not need adjusting. It was not nervousness, it was focus, a mind giving itself something to hold on to while the body waited for the storm. Daniel Marsh hummed quietly to himself, a tune I did not recognize, something simple and old, the kind of song passed down through generations rather than written for any single moment. When he noticed me watching, he did not stop. He only glanced my way and offered a small nod, as if to say, "This is normal, this is fine, we do this." Grace Bennett spoke once more before the fighting began, her voice low enough that only I could hear it over the wind. "You're wondering why we're not scared," she said. It wasn't a question. I did not deny it. "I am," I admitted. She adjusted the strap across her shoulder, eyes still fixed on the horizon. "We are scared, Ren," she said. "All of us. Every single time. You just don't get to see it the way you think you would. Fear doesn't always look like shaking hands. Sometimes it looks like this." I turned the words over in my mind, searching for meaning the way my people search for patterns in data. On my world, fear was measured, categorized, treated as a variable to be reduced through preparation and control. I had never considered that fear could be present and still produce something calm, something steady, something that looked, from the outside, almost like courage. Sergeant Pierce moved along the ridge, checking each position without hurry, his presence somehow settling the air around him further. When he reached me, he crouched low, resting one hand briefly on my shoulder plate, a gesture I did not fully understand, but did not resist. "First fight is always the hardest," he said, "not because of what's coming, because you don't know yet what you can carry. After today, you'll know." I wanted to ask him what he meant, but the scanner beside Lieutenant Whitfield gave a sharp, rising tone, and all conversation ended at once. The dark shapes below had reached the base of the ridge, and the ground itself seemed to hold its breath. I thought, in that final quiet moment, that I finally understood something about humans, that their calm was simply another form of safe discipline, learned differently but built from the same foundation. I believed, foolishly, that I had already seen the deepest part of what made them capable of standing where other species would break and run. I had not seen anything yet. I had only seen the surface, the small and ordinary courage of soldiers waiting for a fight they expected to survive. What I would witness in the hours that followed was something else entirely, something that had no place in any report I had ever read, something that would follow me long after the ridge, the valley, and the war itself had become memory. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of ozone and turned earth, and somewhere far below, the first wave of the scarn began its climb toward the ridge. My hearts pounded, my mind screamed retreat. Every instinct trained into me for 100 years of safe doctrine told me this was the moment to fall back, to preserve the line, to live to fight another day. The humans beside me did not move an inch, and that, more than anything the enemy had ever done to me, was the moment I began to understand what true terror really looked like. The first shots came from below, not from us. Bright bursts of energy climbed the slope in ragged lines, and the ground around our position erupted in showers of frozen dirt. I dropped low on instinct, my training taking over before my mind could catch up, and beside me, Lieutenant Whitfield returned fire without hesitation, her weapon steady despite the chaos closing in around us. "Contact," she called out, voice sharp but controlled. "Southern slope, 40 meters and closing." I raised my own weapon and fired into the advancing shapes, watching several fall before the rest simply climbed over them and kept coming. This was the nature of the scarn. Individual losses meant nothing to the mind that commanded them. You could break their bodies by the 100, and the swarm would not slow, would not hesitate, would not mourn. "Hold," Sergeant Pierce called from further down the line. "Hold and pick your targets. Don't waste rounds on the ones already falling." I found his calm strange even now, in the middle of gunfire and screaming metal. My own hearts hammered against my ribs, and every part of my training screamed that this position could not hold, that the numbers below us were too great, that retreat was the only rational choice remaining. Yet Pierce moved along the ridge as though directing a drill exercise, correcting angles, calling adjustments, never raising his voice beyond what was needed to be heard. Daniel Marsh fought beside me, and I noticed something odd in the rhythm of his movements. He fired, reloaded, fired again, and between each burst he muttered small phrases under his breath. Not prayers, not curses, just words, steady and constant, like a man counting his own heartbeat aloud to make sure it was still there. "You all right?" he called to me during a brief lull, when the nearest wave had been pushed back and the next had not yet arrived. "I am functioning," I answered, which was true in the way numbers are true, without capturing the deeper reality of what I felt. He laughed, short and breathless. "That's a very safe way of saying you're terrified," he said. I did not deny it this time. "I am terrified," I admitted. "Your kind fight as though this is expected, as though losing this ridge was never a possibility you considered." Grace Bennett, further along the line, caught the tail end of my words and called back without turning from her position. "Oh, we considered it," she said. "We just decided it wasn't an option today." I did not understand the distinction then. To my mind, trained in a culture built on calculated risk and acceptable loss, the idea of deciding an outcome was unavailable to reason felt like a contradiction, a denial of the numbers in front of us. And yet here they were, holding a line that any safe commander would have already ordered abandoned, and somehow, impossibly, the line was holding. The swarm surged again, and this time the numbers pressing up the slope were greater than before. I felt the ground tremble beneath the weight of so many bodies moving as one, and for the first time since arriving on this world, I understood what it meant to face an enemy that did not fear death because it did not truly value the lives it spent. "Second wave incoming," Lieutenant Whitfield called, her voice tightening slightly for the first time since the battle began. "Numbers are climbing faster than projected." "How much faster?" Pierce asked. "Double the initial estimate," she answered. "Maybe more." I expected panic then. I expected the calm to finally break, the mask to slip, revealing whatever true fear lay beneath the practiced steadiness these humans had shown me all morning. Instead, Pierce simply nodded, adjusted his grip on his weapon, and spoke words that I have carried with me every day since. "Then we hold twice as hard," he said. There was no bravado in his voice, no false confidence meant to steady frightened soldiers. It was simply a statement of intent, as plain and certain as stating the time of day. I looked around at the small group defending that ridge. 5 humans and 2 coalition soldiers against a swarm that outnumbered us beyond any reasonable calculation. And I felt something shift inside me, a crack forming in the foundation of everything I believed about strength and survival. The swarm broke against our position like a wave against stone, and for a moment, impossibly, we held. Bodies fell on both sides, the air filled with the acrid smell of scorched earth and spent energy cells. Somewhere to my left, one of the other coalition soldiers, a quiet Threllan named Vess, took a wound to the shoulder and staggered, and it was Grace Bennett who moved without being asked, dragging him back behind a ridge of broken stone, applying pressure to the wound with hands that did not shake despite the chaos surrounding her. "You're fine," she told him, voice firm and warm at once. "You're fine. Stay with me." I watched this exchange while continuing to fire into the advancing shapes below, and I found myself struck by something I had not expected to feel on this battlefield, a strange and unfamiliar warmth, entirely separate from the fear and the fighting. These humans, whom my people had labeled unpredictable and undisciplined, moved through this chaos with a kind of care for one another that I had rarely witnessed even among my own kind during moments of calm, let alone during combat. The swarm pulled back briefly, regrouping at the base of the ridge, and in that brief silence, Daniel Marsh turned to me, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, and asked a question I did not expect. "Do your people have something like this?" he said. "Something you fight for, beyond just orders and numbers?" I considered the question carefully, the way I consider most things, weighing it against everything I understood about my own culture. "We fight for the preservation of our people," I answered. "For the continuation of our species and our worlds." "That's not quite what I meant," he said, reloading his weapon with steady hands. "I meant something smaller, something like this moment, something like the person standing next to you." I did not have an answer for him then. I have one now, though it came too late to give him the comfort he might have wanted in that moment. The swarm began its next advance, larger than the last, dark shapes flooding up the slope in numbers that made my calculations feel meaningless. Lieutenant Whitfield called out troop positions with a voice growing tighter by the second, and somewhere behind us, through the comm channel, Coalition Command issued the first warning of what was to come. "All units prepare for possible withdrawal," the voice said, flat and distant, utterly removed from the desperate reality unfolding on that ridge. "Hold positions until ordered otherwise." Pierce did not respond to the order directly. Instead, he turned to his squad, and to me, and said words that would echo through everything that followed in the hours ahead. "We're not going anywhere," he said. "Not today." I believed, in that moment, that I finally understood the depth of human courage, that I had witnessed the full measure of what made them capable of holding lines other species would abandon. I was wrong. I had only seen the beginning. What came next, as the swarm surged forward in numbers beyond counting, would show me a side of humanity that no report, no training, and no amount of calculation could have prepared me for. The ridge shook beneath the weight of the advancing swarm, and somewhere in the noise and chaos, I heard Grace Bennett begin to sing, quiet and steady, a tune with no particular meaning that I could identify, simply a sound to hold on to amid the storm. Daniel Marsh joined her after a moment, his voice rough but certain, and even Lieutenant Whitfield, focused entirely on the battle unfolding before us, allowed the smallest trace of a smile to cross her face. I did not understand it then, this strange human habit of finding music inside chaos, of holding on to small and simple things while facing overwhelming danger. I understand it now. It was never a distraction from the fear. It was a way of proving, to themselves and to each other, that the fear had not yet won. The order came through clearly this time, no longer a suggestion but a command, backed by the full weight of coalition authority. All forward positions were to withdraw immediately, falling back to the secondary line 3 kilometers behind us, where reinforcements and heavier defenses waited. I felt relief wash through me at the words, the promise of survival after a battle that had already stretched far beyond what I believed any group of soldiers could endure. "Fall back," Lieutenant Whitfield relayed, her voice carrying clearly across the ridge. "Command wants us at the secondary line. Now." I began to move, gathering my gear, ready to follow the order that every instinct in my body demanded I obey. It was only after several steps that I realized none of the humans around me had moved at all. Sergeant Pierce remained exactly where he stood, weapon still trained on the slope below, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "Sergeant," I called, "we have been ordered to withdraw." He did not look at me right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the swarm regrouping below, calculating something I could not see. When he finally spoke, his voice held none of the calm certainty I had grown used to over the past hours. It held something else, something heavier. "If we fall back now," he said, "the swarm reaches the supply corridor before the secondary line can form. 3,000 civilians are still in that corridor waiting for evacuation transports that won't arrive for another hour." I felt something cold settle into my chest. The order from command had not accounted for this. Perhaps command did not know. Perhaps command knew and had made a calculation of their own, one that valued the ridge less than the resources waiting to be salvaged elsewhere. I had seen such calculations made before, by my own people, in wars fought long before this one. Sacrifice was sometimes necessary. Sacrifice was, in the coldest sense, mathematics. "Sergeant," I said again, "if we remain, the numbers suggest we will not survive contact with the next wave." Pierce turned to look at me then, and in his eyes I saw something that no report on human psychology had ever described to me, a clarity so absolute it bordered on terrifying. It was not anger, it was not despair, it was a decision already made, settled and complete, with no room left for negotiation. "Then we won't survive," he said, "but those people will." I stood frozen for a moment, caught between the order I had been given and the reality unfolding in front of me. Every part of my training told me this was irrational, a decision made from emotion rather than calculation, the very flaw my people had always attributed to humans. And yet as I looked at the faces around me, Grace Bennett checking her remaining ammunition without complaint, Daniel Marsh tightening the strap on his weapon with steady hands, Lieutenant Whitfield already relaying new defensive positions despite the order to withdraw, I saw no irrationality at all. I saw something else, something with its own terrible logic, one that measured value not in numbers of survivors, but in the weight of a promise made and kept. Command repeated the withdrawal order twice more over the comm channel, each time more urgent than the last. Pierce answered only once, his voice steady despite the noise building around us. "Negative," he said. "Second squad is holding position. Get those transports moving faster if you want us alive to greet them." I do not know what happened on the other end of that channel. I only know that no further orders came, and the swarm, having regrouped at the base of the ridge, began its next advance, larger and faster than anything we had faced before. I fought that hour with a strange, divided mind, half of me calculating the odds of our survival, numbers falling lower with every passing minute, and half of me simply watching, transfixed, as the humans around me continued fighting with a focus that seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker as the danger increased. I had expected fear to break them eventually. Instead, I watched fear seem to sharpen them, honing their focus into something almost unbearably precise. It was during this advance that I witnessed the moment that changed everything I believed about human limits. Daniel Marsh took a wound to his side, a burst of enemy fire catching him as he moved between defensive positions. He fell hard against the frozen ground, and for a moment I believed the fight had ended for him, that his part in this battle was finished. I moved toward him instinctively, prepared to offer what aid I could, when he pushed himself back up, one hand pressed against the wound, blood dark against his uniform, and raised his weapon again with the other. "Daniel," I called, "you are wounded. You must withdraw from the position." He did not look at me. His eyes remained fixed on the slope below, tracking movement among the advancing swarm. "Later," he said, voice tight with pain but unwavering in its focus. "Right now, they need this position held. I have read reports, countless reports, on the physiology of injury and the limits of the body under combat stress. Every calculation I understood told me that a wound of that severity should have ended his ability to fight, that continuing was not simply reckless but physically implausible. And yet he continued, firing with steady precision, holding his section of the line as though the wound belonged to someone else entirely. This was the moment I felt true terror, for the first time since arriving on that ridge. Not terror of the Skarn, whose numbers and tactics I understood, whose threat I could calculate and plan against. This was terror of something else, something I had no framework to measure, no data to compare it against. It was the terror of watching a creature continue functioning past every limit I understood the body to possess, driven by something that was not madness, was not simple duty, was not even the survival instinct that governs most living things. It was something chosen, deliberate, and utterly beyond my ability to predict. I turned to Lieutenant Whitfield, hoping she might share some fraction of the alarm building inside me. Instead, I found her calling for a medic to reach Daniel's position while continuing to direct fire against the advancing swarm, her voice carrying the same steady calm it had held since the battle began. "He'll hold," she said, almost to herself. "He always holds." I wanted to ask her how she could be certain of such a thing, how any commander could rely on a wounded soldier continuing to function at the edge of collapse. But there was no time for questions. The swarm was nearly upon us again, and the numbers pressing against our position had grown larger still, a black tide climbing the frozen slope with a patience that suggested the mind behind it had all the time in the galaxy to spend on our destruction. Grace Bennett reached Daniel's position moments later, applying a field dressing with quick, practiced hands while he continued firing over her shoulder, refusing to lower his weapon even as she worked. There was no argument between them, no attempt to force him back from the line. She simply worked around his continued fighting, as though this was expected, as though this was normal, as though the body's supposed limits were merely suggestions rather than absolute laws. "I am fine," Daniel said through gritted teeth, more to reassure her than to answer any question she had asked. "You're an idiot," she answered, tightening the dressing with more force than necessary. "But you're my idiot, so stay alive." The exchange, brief and strange, struck me harder than any moment of the battle itself. Here, in the middle of overwhelming danger, wounded and outnumbered, these two humans found room for warmth, for something that resembled affection more than duty. I did not understand it fully then. I understand it better now, though the understanding came at a cost I still carry. The swarm reached our position again, and this time the fighting grew close enough that I could see individual Skarn soldiers clearly, their featureless faces betraying nothing, their movements coordinated by a will that was not their own. We held them back through sheer effort, every soldier on that ridge fighting past the point where exhaustion should have claimed them, past the point where fear should have driven them to abandon the position entirely. Command's voice returned to the comm channel once more, this time carrying a note of something I had not heard from Coalition Command before, something close to concern. "Second Squad. Transports are still 14 minutes out. Can you hold?" Pierce answered without hesitation, his voice rough now from the strain of continuous combat, but no less certain than it had been at the beginning. "We'll hold," he said. "Just get them here." I looked at the soldiers around me in that moment, wounded, exhausted, facing numbers that made survival seem like a mathematical impossibility, and I understood, with a clarity that frightened me more than the swarm itself, that they meant every word. There was no bravado in the statement, no attempt to project confidence they did not feel. It was simply a fact, stated plainly, the way one might state the distance to a destination or the time remaining before dawn. The swarm surged forward once more, and I raised my weapon alongside theirs, no longer calculating odds, no longer searching for the rational path toward survival, but simply holding the line beside soldiers who had shown me, in the span of a single impossible hour, that some things mattered more than the numbers that governed them. The other coalition units on the wider line began their withdrawal soon after, following the order that Pierce and his squad had refused. I watched through gaps in the fighting as distant shapes, my own kind among them, retreated toward the secondary defenses, leaving our small position increasingly isolated against the swarm's advance. I understood the logic of their choice. I had been trained in that same logic. Preserve the greater force, accept the loss of the smaller position. It was not cowardice, it was mathematics, cold and impersonal, the same mathematics that had governed every war my people had ever fought. And yet, standing on that ridge, watching allies of my own species vanish into the tree line, while a handful of humans continued holding a position that mathematics declared unwinnable, I felt something inside me shift permanently away from the beliefs I had carried my entire life. The swarm pressed harder now that our flanks had been exposed by the wider retreat. Lieutenant Whitfield called out new positions, pulling the remaining defenders into a tighter formation around the ridge's central outcropping, a natural choke point that offered our only remaining advantage. I moved to join them, my earlier fear now buried beneath something closer to grim determination, though I could not have named the feeling at the time. We lost radio contact with the wider coalition line shortly after, the constant hum of comm traffic falling silent as distance and interference swallowed the signal. For the first time since the battle began, we were entirely alone, 7 soldiers against a swarm whose numbers seemed to multiply with every passing minute. It was in this isolation that I witnessed the moment I have struggled hardest to describe to others since, the moment that gave this account its name. Lieutenant Whitfield made a decision I did not expect, one that revealed a side of human command I had never encountered in any coalition briefing. She ordered Vess, the wounded Thralan soldier, along with the remaining defensive shield generator, move to the outcropping's eastern edge, a position that would draw significant enemy attention away from the main group but offered little chance of the generator's survival, and by extension, little chance for whoever remained beside it. "I need someone to hold that flank for as long as possible," she said, her voice carrying none of the softness I had grown used to. "It won't hold long. Whoever takes it needs to understand that." I expected an argument, a moment of hesitation among the soldiers gathered around her. Instead, Grace Bennett stepped forward without a word, checking her weapon's charge and moving toward the position before anyone else could volunteer. "I've got it," she said simply. Whitfield studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before nodding once. 15 minutes, she said. "That's all we need." "I'll give you 20, Grace answered, and then she was gone, moving toward the exposed flank with the same steady calm she had shown throughout the entire battle. I did not understand what I had just witnessed until the swarm's next advance began, the majority of its force redirecting toward the weaker flank exactly as Whitfield had calculated. Grace Bennett held that position alone against a force that would have overwhelmed an entire coalition platoon, and she held it not through superior weaponry or tactical advantage, but through something I can only describe as pure, unrelenting refusal to fall. I watched from the central position as she fought, her figure small against the dark tide pressing toward her, and I understood, with a horror that settled deep into my bones, that Whitfield had made this decision knowing full well what it might cost, and Grace had accepted the assignment knowing the same. This was not the cold mathematics I had grown up with, where losses were calculated and accepted from a comfortable distance. This was something far more terrible, a willingness to look directly at the cost and choose it anyway, eyes open, without illusion. Daniel Marsh, still wounded from earlier in the battle, moved to reinforce her position without being ordered to do so, dragging himself across the frozen ground despite Whitfield's sharp command to remain with the main group. I watched him fight beside Grace, both of them holding a flank that should have collapsed within minutes, and I felt something building inside me that I had never experienced before. Not fear exactly, though fear remained present, but something larger, a kind of awe so total it bordered on terror. These were not soldiers following orders blindly. These were not creatures driven by instinct alone. They were making a choice, again and again, in every passing second, to continue standing against odds that offered no rational hope of survival, because the alternative meant abandoning someone who needed them. The swarm broke through the outer edge of Grace's position eventually, numbers simply too great for 2 soldiers to hold indefinitely, and I saw her fall back toward Daniel's position, both of them fighting now in close combat, weapons nearly spent, the black tide closing around them with terrible patience. Whitfield's voice cut through the chaos, sharp with an urgency that finally cracked the calm she had maintained throughout the entire day. "Fall back to the center," she called. "Now. Both of you, now." I do not know if they heard her over the noise of battle. I only know that they did not fall back immediately, continuing instead to hold the position for several more precious seconds, buying time that the shield generator desperately needed to complete whatever function Whitfield had assigned it. It was in this moment, watching two wounded humans stand against an overwhelming tide with nothing left but sheer will, that I finally understood the true nature of the terror this day had shown me. It was not terror of the Scarn, whose numbers and tactics remained, in the end, predictable and calculable. It was terror of the humans themselves, or rather, terror of what they represented, a species capable of looking directly at certain loss and choosing to stand anyway, not from ignorance of the danger, not from misplaced confidence, but from something far more absolute, a decision that some things mattered more than survival itself. The Scarn had no framework for this. I could see it in the swarm's movements, the way its advance faltered slightly at the unexpected resistance, the collective mind behind it struggling to process an enemy that continued fighting long past the point where calculation demanded surrender. The Scarn understood sacrifice only as a tool of numbers, bodies spent without thought or grief. They did not understand sacrifice as a choice, made by an individual mind, for the sake of another individual mind. This was a weapon they had never encountered, and I watched, in real time, as it began to break something in their advance. Grace and Daniel fell back to the central position finally, both wounded further, both exhausted beyond anything I believed a body could endure, and yet both still standing, still fighting, still holding weapons steady despite everything working against them. Whitfield greeted them with no words of relief, no expression of the fear she must have carried during those endless minutes, only a sharp nod and immediate orders to fill the gaps in the central line. The shield generator activated moments later, a pulse of energy washing outward across the ridge, and for the first time since the battle began, I saw the swarm's advance genuinely stagger, confused by a defense it had not anticipated. Sergeant Pierce's voice cut through the momentary lull, rough with exhaustion but no less certain than it had been at the beginning of this impossible day. "That's our window," he said. "Hold here. Reinforcements are close." I did not know if this was true, or simply another statement of will disguised as fact, the kind of certainty humans seem to manufacture from nothing when the situation demanded it. I only knew that I believed him, standing on that ridge among soldiers who had shown me, again and again, throughout this endless day, that belief itself could become a kind of weapon when wielded with enough conviction. The swarm gathered itself for what I sensed would be its final advance, numbers still vast despite everything we had cost them, and I raised my weapon alongside the remaining defenders, no longer thinking of myself as separate from them, no longer calculating the odds of safe survival against human survival, but simply standing, as they stood, prepared to hold this ground for as long as our bodies allowed. I had come to this world believing humans were the unpredictable element in our coalition, the flaw in an otherwise rational alliance. I understood now, standing among their wounded and their exhausted and their utterly unbroken will, that I had been wrong in the most fundamental way possible. They were not unpredictable, they were simply operating according to a logic I had never been taught to recognize, one where the value of a single life could outweigh every calculation of odds and numbers, one where terror itself could be transformed into something that looked, from just the right angle, almost like hope. The final advance came just as the sky began to darken toward evening, the swarm gathering itself into a single overwhelming mass that climbed the ridge with a patience that felt, in that moment, almost mocking. I remember thinking, with the strange clarity that sometimes arrives in the final moments before an ending, that this was the calculation finally catching up to us, the debt of impossible odds finally coming due. "Hold," Sergeant Pierce called, and his voice carried none of the exhaustion I expected after everything his body had endured. "Hold the line. This is the last push." I fired until my weapon's charge ran low, then fired again after a hurried reload, standing shoulder to shoulder with soldiers who had already given more than any calculation would have demanded of them. Lieutenant Whitfield directed the remaining defenses with a focus that seemed to sharpen rather than fade as the danger grew, and beside me, Daniel Marsh and Grace Bennett fought on despite wounds that should have ended their part in this battle hours earlier. It was in the middle of this final advance that I heard something new cutting through the noise of battle, a distant rumble growing steadily louder, engines and repulsors climbing over the ridge from the direction of the secondary line. For a moment I believed it was simply another wave of the enemy, some new horror the Scarn had held in reserve. Then Lieutenant Whitfield's voice rose above the chaos, carrying something I had not heard from her throughout the entire battle, something close to relief. "Reinforcements," she called. "That's our reinforcements." I looked up in time to see the first transports crest the ridge behind us, coalition soldiers pouring out before the vehicles had even come to a full stop, weapons already firing into the swarm's exposed flank. Among them I recognized soldiers of my own species, Saith, who had retreated earlier under orders, now returning alongside human forces that had rallied from the secondary line the moment word reached them that second squad had refused to abandon the ridge. I learned later, from soldiers who fought in that relief force, that word of our refusal to withdraw had spread through the wider coalition line faster than any official communication could have carried it. Other units, seeing that a handful of humans had chosen to hold an impossible position rather than abandon civilians still waiting for evacuation, found themselves unable to simply continue their own retreat. Saith commanders who had ordered withdrawal reversed their decisions within minutes, joined by soldiers from half a dozen other coalition species, all moving to reinforce a position that mathematics alone would never have justified defending. The Scarn's advance, already strained by the unexpected resistance it had faced throughout the day, finally broke under the combined weight of the reinforcement wave. I watched the swarm's remaining numbers scatter and retreat down the slope, the collective mind behind them apparently deciding, at last, that this position had cost more than it was worth. The silence that followed felt strange after so many hours of constant noise, the kind of silence that seems to ring in the ears rather than simply exist. I lowered my weapon slowly, uncertain for a moment whether the battle had truly ended, and looked around at the soldiers who had held that ridge alongside me. Grace Bennett sat heavily against a section of broken stone, her uniform torn and stained, her face pale from exhaustion and blood loss, and yet she was laughing, a soft, tired sound that seemed to carry relief more than any real humor. Daniel Marsh sat beside her, equally exhausted, joining her laughter despite the wound still visible beneath his hastily applied dressing. "Told you I'd hold 20 minutes, Grace said between breaths. "You held 23, Daniel answered. "Overachiever." I did not understand the humor at first, standing there in the aftermath of a battle that had nearly ended all our lives. It seemed strange, almost inappropriate, to find laughter so soon after such loss and danger. I understand it now. It was not disrespect toward what had happened. It was the opposite, a way of proving, to themselves and to each other, that they had survived to feel something other than fear. Sergeant Pierce moved among the wounded, checking on each soldier personally despite his own exhaustion, offering quiet words of reassurance that seemed to carry more weight coming from him than any medical assessment could have provided. When he reached me, he studied my expression for a long moment, perhaps reading something in my posture that betrayed the turmoil still settling inside me. "First real fight," he said. "It shows." "I do not know how to describe what I witnessed today," I admitted, the words coming slower than usual, weighed down by everything I had seen. "My people call your species unpredictable. I do not believe that word applies any longer." Pierce allowed himself a tired smile, the first genuine expression of relief I had seen from him since the battle began. "What word would you use instead?" he asked. I considered the question carefully, searching through everything I had witnessed throughout that endless day, the calm before the fighting, the refusal to retreat despite direct orders, the sacrifice offered without hesitation, the will that continued past every limit I believed the body could endure. "I do not have a word for it yet," I admitted. "My language was not built to describe what I saw today." He nodded slowly, glancing back toward Grace and Daniel, still sitting together against the broken stone, still finding room for quiet laughter, despite everything they had survived. Maybe you don't need a word, he said. Maybe you just need to remember it. The transports began evacuating the wounded soon after, and I found myself walking among the aftermath of the battle, surveying the ridge that had nearly claimed all our lives. The frozen ground was scarred and blackened, evidence of a fight that would be remembered, I suspected, far beyond this single battlefield. Lieutenant Whitfield stood near the shield generator that had ultimately turned the tide, speaking quietly with the officers arriving from the relief force, her posture straight, despite the exhaustion clearly weighing on her. She caught my eye as I passed and offered a small nod of acknowledgement, the kind exchange between soldiers who have shared something neither fully expects to explain to those who were not present. "You held well, Rain," she said, "for someone experiencing this for the first time." "I did very little compared to what I witnessed from your soldiers," I answered honestly. "I do not know if my people would have made the same choices you made today." She considered this for a moment, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "Maybe not," she said, "but you stayed. That counts for more than you think." I thought about her words for a long while after the battle ended, as the relief force secured the ridge and the last of the wounded were carried toward waiting transports. I thought about the strange calm the humans had shown before the fighting began, a calm I had mistaken for simple discipline, when it was something far deeper, a quiet acceptance of fear that allowed them to function despite it rather than in spite of it. I thought about Daniel Marsh continuing to fight through a wound that should have ended his part in the battle, driven by something I still struggle to fully name. I thought about Grace Bennett walking alone toward a flank she knew offered little chance of survival, choosing that fate not from ignorance or misplaced confidence, but from a clear-eyed understanding of what needed to be done and a willingness to do it anyway. I understood, finally, standing on that scarred and silent ridge as evening settled fully over the valley, what true terror actually meant. It was not the terror of facing an enemy whose numbers and tactics could be calculated and countered. That terror, however great, remained within the bounds of reason, a fear that could be measured and managed through preparation and strategy. The terror I felt that day was something else entirely. The terror of standing beside a species capable of looking directly at certain loss and choosing to remain anyway, not from lack of understanding, but from a value so different from my own that I had no framework to predict what they might do next. The Skarn, for all their overwhelming numbers and patient cruelty, had never encountered an enemy who fought this way. Their collective mind understood sacrifice only as an equation, bodies spent without weight or meaning. They could not comprehend an enemy who chose sacrifice individually, deliberately, for reasons that had nothing to do with numbers at all. I believe, though I cannot prove it, that this single difference, more than any weapon or tactic our coalition possessed, was what finally turned that battle in our favor. In the days that followed, as Outpost Farron returned to some semblance of normal function and the wounded began their recovery, I found myself spending more time among the human soldiers than I had before the battle. I watched them grieve for those lost during the fighting, quiet moments shared between friends, stories told and retold about soldiers who would not return. I watched them laugh again, sooner than I expected, finding humor in small things, as though determined not to let grief claim every part of their remaining days. I understood now that this was not disrespect toward the fallen, but rather the opposite, a way of honoring the fact that they themselves had survived to feel joy again. Grace Bennett found me one evening, sitting alone near the edge of the outpost, watching the same ridge where the battle had unfolded days earlier. "Still doing math in your head?" she asked, echoing words from before the battle had begun. "Always," I answered, and for the first time, I found myself smiling slightly at the familiar exchange. She sat beside me quietly for a while, both of us watching the darkening sky above the valley. "You looked pretty scared out there," she said eventually, before the fighting started. "I was scared," I admitted. "I have never known fear like what I felt on that ridge." She nodded, understanding something in my words that required no further explanation. "That's all right," she said. "Scared just means you understood what was at stake. The trick isn't getting rid of the fear, it's learning to stand anyway." I thought about her words long after that conversation ended, turning them over in my mind the way I turn over any piece of information that reshapes my understanding of the world. I had come to this posting believing my people understood strength better than humans ever could. that our discipline and calculation represented a superior approach to war and survival. I understood now how wrong that belief had been. Humans did not lack discipline. They simply built it from a different foundation, one rooted not in the avoidance of fear, but in the choice to act despite it, not in the preservation of the self above all else, but in a willingness to weigh the value of another life against their own, and, when necessary, choose the other. This was not weakness, as I had once believed. It was perhaps the single greatest strength I had ever witnessed, one that no swarm, no matter how vast, could ever truly comprehend or overcome. I write this account not to frighten those among my own people who might read it, but to warn them, gently, that everything we believed about our human allies requires reconsideration. They are not the unpredictable flaw in our coalition. They are perhaps its greatest strength, a species capable of facing true terror and choosing, again and again, to stand against it anyway. I have come, instead, to feel something closer to gratitude and a quiet, persistent awe for having witnessed exactly what they are capable of when everything else has been stripped away and only the choice remains. That choice, more than any weapon or tactic I have studied throughout my long service, remains the single most terrifying and most reassuring thing I have ever encountered in this long and difficult war. Terrifying because I now understand there is no limit to what humans will sacrifice when something they value hangs in the balance. Reassuring because for as long as I serve beside them, I know that limit will never be tested against me, but always, always spent in my defense.